In the winter of 1849, construction crews demolishing the defunct Whitmore Institute for Refined Ladies in Concord, Massachusetts uncovered a discovery that would terrorize the community for decades. Concealed beneath the Institute's library, floorboards wrapped in oilcloth were 50 small leather diaries, each inscribed with a different girl's name. The pages revealed accounts of unthinkable atrocities, but what horrified authorities most were the carefully documented patron lists containing names that represented the cream of New England's aristocracy. The Commonwealth immediately classified these findings as matters of public security, and those records remain sealed in state archives to this day. What I'm about to share comes from testimonies buried by powerful interests, documents that influential families desperately tried to destroy, and the deathbed confession of a woman who harbored these secrets for 7 decades. If you're someone drawn to uncovering America's most buried truths, someone unafraid to examine the shadows of our nation's history, then this account is meant for you. But I must caution you, what transpired at the Whitmore Institute challenges everything we believed about decency, authority, and purity in 19th century New England. Before we plunge into this chasm of human wickedness, subscribe to the Holloway archives if you're bold enough to explore the mysteries others refuse to confront. And tell me in the comments what region you're watching from, because this evil could have emerged anywhere. Now let me transport you to an era when malevolence disguised itself as righteousness. Concord, Massachusetts in 1810 was a town still wrestling with its turbulent legacy, yet striving to establish itself as a pillar of moral excellence and scholarly achievement. The Salem witch trials of the previous century had cast a permanent shadow over the region's reputation, and by the early 1800s, Concord's prominent families were frantically seeking methods to restore their community's standing in New England society. Into this environment of redemption and renewal came the Ashworth family, bearing flawless references and a vision that would captivate the town's establishment. Rosalind Ashworth was a woman of extraordinary bearing, tall, graceful, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to penetrate one's very essence. Born to a prosperous Georgia plantation dynasty, she had received the most comprehensive education available to women of her class, studying philosophy and sciences in Philadelphia, before spending 18 months in Paris absorbing revolutionary educational theories. Her husband, Dr. Edmund Ashworth, had perished in a cholera epidemic in New Orleans, leaving her widowed at 34 with a considerable fortune and an unwavering determination to dedicate her existence to the moral transformation of young womanhood. When Rosalind announced her plan to establish the Whitmore Institute for Refined Ladies in Concord, the town's Presbyterian leadership welcomed her proposal with tremendous enthusiasm. Here was a woman of obvious cultivation and Christian devotion, offering to provide complimentary education to orphaned and destitute girls, while also accommodating paying pupils from respectable households. The Institute would teach not merely reading, writing, and mathematics, but also art, German, embroidery, and most crucially, moral guidance grounded in Protestant principles. The structure Rosalind chose for her institute carried a history as complex as Concord itself. The imposing 4-story federal mansion on Heritage Hill had been built in 1792 by shipping magnate Thomas Blackwood, who had accumulated his wealth through Caribbean commerce. Following Blackwood's death in 1808, the estate had remained unoccupied, its shuttered windows gazing over Concord River like hollow sockets. Local inhabitants whispered that the house was hexed, for separate families had attempted residence and each had fled within weeks, citing unexplained sounds and a crushing atmosphere that seemed to smother them like a physical presence. But Rosalind Ashworth displayed no concern for such folklore. She acquired the property for half its market value and immediately commenced comprehensive renovations. Workers added a sanctuary wing complete with colored glass windows, portraying scenes from biblical heroines' lives. They built sleeping quarters, accommodating 40 girls, a refectory seating 70, and most remarkably, a series of private chambers on the 4th floor that Rosalind characterized as contemplation rooms, where pupils could ponder their spiritual growth in isolation. Accompanying Rosalind in her virtuous mission were two relatives, who shared her passion for education and moral guidance. Cordelia Ashworth, Rosalind's elder sister, was a frail woman with snow-white hair and hands that quivered when she spoke, a condition she blamed on a childhood malady. Despite her delicate constitution, Cordelia possessed an extraordinary talent for art and linguistics, serving as the Institute's primary instructor in these disciplines. Her voice, when leading hymns during chapel services, was reportedly so enchanting that even the most callous merchants would halt their activities to listen. When the melody drifted from the Institute's windows, the third member of the Ashworth Trinity was Jeremiah Ashworth, Rosalind's brother-in-law and a man whose presence seemed to cast shadows, even in brilliant daylight. Towering and skeletal with sunken eyes and a voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, Jeremiah had spent 12 years as an itinerant minister throughout the Western Territories before accepting Rosalind's invitation to serve as the Institute's chaplain. His sermons about the depravity of contemporary society and the particular susceptibility of young women to demonic influences were renowned across the region. Parents who heard him preach felt simultaneously terrified for their daughter's spiritual welfare and grateful that such a vigilant protector would be supervising them at Whitmore. The Institute officially welcomed its first students on October 3, 1810, with considerable ceremony. Concord's selectmen attended the inauguration alongside several federal representatives and the Bishop of the Methodist Conference of Massachusetts. Rosalind's opening remarks, delivered from the Institute's entrance as October leaves swirled around her navy velvet gown, spoke of creating a haven of learning where young ladies could cultivate both intellectual excellence and moral fortitude, shielded from the corrupting influences of a world increasingly dominated by materialism and vice. The inaugural class entering Whitmore Institute comprised a carefully chosen group of 28 girls ranging from 11 to 18 years. Some originated from established Concord families who paid the considerable tuition of $75 annually, a sum representing nearly half a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. But Rosalind's proclaimed mission was serving the less fortunate, and more than half the initial enrollment consisted of orphans and daughters of impoverished families accepted without cost as demonstrations of the Institute's Christian compassion. Among these charity pupils was 13-year-old Catherine O'Brien, whose Scottish immigrant parents had died in a factory accident the previous autumn. Catherine was an intelligent, vivacious girl with auburn curls and hazel eyes that sparkled with wit and wonder. She had been laboring in a rope factory for 8 months when an Institute representative approached her with an opportunity that seemed impossibly generous: free lodging, meals, and education in exchange for assistance with household duties around the Institute. Another was 16-year-old Rebecca Foster, whose father had been killed in a mill accident and whose mother had succumbed to pneumonia, leaving her dependent on an aunt who made clear her resentment of the burden. Rebecca was reserved and studious, with chestnut hair worn in a practical braid and a passion for reading any volume she could locate. The prospect of attending an authentic school with access to a collection and qualified instructors felt like divine intervention. The third was 12-year-old Emma Caldwell, perhaps the most heartbreaking case of all. Emma's father had been imprisoned for forgery and sentenced to 7 years hard labor, while her mother had simply vanished one evening, leaving only a letter stating she could no longer endure the disgrace. Emma had been surviving in the Concord almshouse when Rosalind Ashworth personally visited and extended her a place at the Institute. The child's gaunt, hollow-cheeked face had illuminated for the first time in months upon learning she would have her own cot, regular meals, and the opportunity to learn proper reading. These girls, alongside their 25 classmates, entered Whitmore Institute with hearts overflowing with hope and gratitude. They had no means of knowing they were stepping into an elaborately constructed snare that the woman who vowed to safeguard their virtue intended to destroy their innocence, and that the elegant federal mansion overlooking Concord River would become their cage, their torment, and for many, their sepulture. The first indication that something was gravely wrong at Whitmore Institute came not from the pupils themselves but from Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, a dressmaker who resided in a humble dwelling at the base of Heritage Hill. Mrs. Pemberton had been contracted to supply fabrics and garments for the Institute, and her weekly deliveries provided opportunities to observe the daily operations of the establishment from afar. It was on a misty November morning in 1811, precisely 13 months after the Institute's inauguration, that Mrs. Pemberton first detected something unusual. She had arrived earlier than scheduled to deliver a consignment of winter shawls and was startled to witness several elegantly dressed gentlemen departing from the Institute's rear entrance, the same entrance providing direct access to the private chambers on the 4th floor. What struck her as peculiar was not simply their pre-dawn departure, but their obvious attempts to avoid detection. They moved swiftly to waiting carriages, keeping their faces lowered and their hat brims pulled over their features. Over subsequent weeks, Mrs. Pemberton began observing more closely the traffic at the Institute. She noticed these enigmatic visitors invariably arrived after nightfall and consistently used the rear entrance. Sometimes only 1 or 2 carriages would appear. Other evenings she counted as many as 8. The vehicles bore no identification, but even in the dim gaslight, she could discern they were costly, the type owned by bankers' officials or other men of substantial means. More alarming were the changes she observed in the students themselves. The girls who had entered the Institute with radiant faces and enthusiastic expressions were becoming increasingly withdrawn and hollow-eyed. During her deliveries, Mrs. Pemberton would occasionally glimpse them through windows, and what she witnessed troubled her profoundly. Many appeared lethargic and moved with an odd, dreamlike quality as if navigating through fog. Some bore visible injuries, bruises on their necks hastily concealed beneath high collars, cuts on their wrists explained away as sewing mishaps. The transformation was most apparent in Catherine O'Brien, the spirited Scottish girl who had once conversed eagerly about her lessons whenever Mrs. Pemberton encountered her. By winter, Catherine seldom spoke at all. Her lustrous auburn hair had become dull and brittle, hanging in lifeless strands around a face grown gaunt and ashen. When she did meet Mrs. Pemberton's gaze, there was something frantic in her expression, as if she were attempting to convey a message she dared not voice. It was on the evening of January 18, 1812, that Mrs. Pemberton witnessed something that would haunt her remaining days. Unable to rest due to severe arthritis, she had risen from bed near 1 o'clock to prepare some willow bark tea. As she stood beside her kitchen window waiting for the kettle to whistle, she observed unusual activity at the Institute. Light flickered in the 4th floor windows, not the steady glow of candles or whale oil, but an irregular, dancing illumination suggesting torches or perhaps a small blaze. Initially, she assumed someone was simply studying late or caring for an ill student, but then she heard sounds that chilled her to the marrow. Muted wailing seemed to emanate from the Institute's sanctuary. The sounds were sporadic, lasting mere moments each time, but they were unmistakably human and unmistakably expressions of anguish or horror. Mrs. Pemberton pressed her face against the frigid window pane, straining to discern more clearly. The sanctuary windows glowed with that same eerie, flickering light, and she could distinguish shadowy figures moving within. The wailing continued intermittently for nearly 2 hours, punctuated by periods of silence that proved somehow more disturbing than the sounds themselves. When dawn broke, Mrs. Pemberton persuaded herself she must have been mistaken, that her pain and fatigue had caused hallucinations. But when she made her next delivery to the Institute 4 days later, she learned that one of the students, young Emma Caldwell, had died suddenly during the night of January 18th. Rosalind Ashworth, attired in mourning dress that somehow made her appear more commanding than grieving, explained that the child had succumbed to sudden brain fever despite the dedicated efforts of the Institute's physician. The funeral was conducted the following morning in the Institute's sanctuary, a small private ceremony attended solely by faculty and students. Mrs. Pemberton was not invited, but she could hear the hymns floating down from the hill, sung in voices that seemed more terrified than mournful. Cordelia Ashworth's ethereal soprano soared above the others, but even her celestial voice could not disguise the underlying note of desperation that appeared to permeate the entire performance. Emma Caldwell was interred in the small graveyard behind the Institute, marked with a plain granite cross bearing only her name and life dates. No family members attended the service. Because she had no family remaining, a fact Rosalind Ashworth observed with what might have been satisfaction rather than sorrow. In the weeks following Emma's death, Mrs. Pemberton noticed several other students appeared to be declining. They moved more slowly, spoke even less frequently, and displayed the same listless behavior that had characterized Emma in her final days. When she diplomatically inquired about their health, Rosalind Ashworth assured her the girls were simply experiencing the natural effects of rigorous academic study combined with the moral discipline necessary for their spiritual development. Young ladies of their unfortunate circumstances, Rosalind explained in her crisp, cultured tone, often require considerable adjustment before they can fully embrace the refined lifestyle we provide here. Some find the transition more demanding than others, but Mrs. Pemberton's suspicions were not so easily dismissed. She began carefully noting which students appeared to be struggling, and she detected a disturbing pattern. The girls who seemed most affected were invariably among the poorest, those with no families to inquire about their well-being or financial resources to depart the institute if they chose. The paying students, while certainly more subdued than upon first arrival, maintained better color and greater alertness. The pattern became undeniable when, in March of 1812, 2 more students died within 10 days. Rebecca Foster, the quiet girl who had cherished reading, was discovered dead in her bed on a Thursday morning, apparently having passed peacefully in her sleep. 10 days later, Anne-Marie Brennan, another Irish orphan, succumbed to what was described as lung fever after a brief illness, characterized by violent coughing spells. Both girls were buried in the Institute cemetery with the same simple ceremony that had marked Emma's passing. Their deaths were reported to municipal authorities, but since Dr. Marcus Ashworth, Jeremiah's nephew, served as both the Institute's physician and the official medical examiner for that district, the deaths were officially attributed to natural causes without further investigation. Mrs. Pemberton found herself torn between her growing suspicions and her awareness that she was merely a simple dressmaker, with no evidence beyond her own observations. Who would believe her if she suggested something sinister was occurring at Concord's most respected academy? For young ladies, Rosalind Ashworth was revered throughout the community. Praised for her charitable work and dedication to education, the Institute received regular visits from local ministers and civic leaders, all of whom spoke admiringly of the institution's mission and accomplishments. Yet she could not dismiss the image of those flickering lights in the sanctuary windows, or the memory of those muffled cries echoing through the January night. Something terrible was happening on Heritage Hill, something the respectable facade of Whitmore Institute was designed to conceal. But it would be years before the truth began emerging, and when it did, the reality would prove far more horrific than even Mrs. Pemberton's darkest suspicions had imagined. By the spring of 1812, an unnatural stillness had descended over Whitmore Institute for Refined Ladies, as if the very timber had absorbed the anguish and secrets within and now radiated an oppressive quiet that seemed to dampen even ordinary sounds. The death of 3 students within 5 months had cast a shadow over the institution. Yet life continued with a routine suggesting these losses were merely unfortunate interruptions in the Institute's noble mission rather than symptoms of something far more malevolent. Rosalind Ashworth adapted to these tragedies with what observers noted as remarkable composure. Rather than allowing grief to overwhelm her, she seemed to derive strength from adversity, speaking frequently about the spiritual trials God sent to test the faithful and the importance of viewing earthly suffering as preparation for celestial reward. Her addresses to the remaining students took on an increasingly fervent quality, dwelling on themes of sacrifice, submission, and the necessity of absolute obedience to those whom God had placed in authority over them. Young ladies, she would intone from the sanctuary pulpit, her piercing blue eyes sweeping across the assembled students like a sword cutting through silk. You must understand that your previous lives of poverty, abandonment, and moral confusion have left stains upon your souls that can only be cleansed through the most rigorous spiritual discipline. The path to redemption is not easy, and some among you may not possess the strength necessary to complete the journey. But for those who do, the rewards will be beyond earthly comprehension. The surviving students had learned to listen to these addresses with carefully composed expressions, revealing nothing of their inner thoughts. They had learned through means both subtle and overt that displays of emotion or independent thinking were not welcomed at Whitmore Institute. Those who asked too many questions or showed excessive curiosity about the Institute's operations found themselves assigned to increasingly unpleasant duties, scrubbing floors with lye soap that burned their hands working in the Institute's garden during the hottest part of summer days, or spending long hours alone in the contemplation rooms on the 4th floor pondering their sins and shortcomings. Catherine O'Brien, now 14 and barely recognizable as the spirited girl who had entered the Institute 20 months earlier, had become a master of this emotional concealment. She moved through her daily routines like a specter haunting familiar halls, speaking only when addressed and keeping her thoughts locked away behind eyes that had learned to reveal nothing. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Catherine's mind remained sharp and observant. She had begun to notice patterns in the Institute's routines that troubled her deeply. She had observed, for instance, that certain students were periodically selected for what Cordelia Ashworth called specialized instruction in the 4th floor chambers. These sessions always occurred in the evening after regular classes had concluded, and the Institute had settled into its nightly quiet. The girls chosen for such instruction would disappear upstairs immediately after supper, often remaining there until well past midnight. When they returned to the dormitory, they moved with the same dreamlike quality that had characterized Emma, Rebecca, and Anne-Marie in their final weeks. More disturbing still was Catherine's growing awareness that these specialized instruction sessions coincided with the visits of the mysterious gentlemen who arrived in unmarked carriages. Through careful observation, she had determined that the rear entrance to the Institute, the one providing direct access to the 4th floor chambers, was used exclusively. During these nocturnal meetings, during daylight hours, all visitors used the main entrance and were received in the Institute's formal drawing room, where their business was conducted with appropriate supervision and ceremony. Catherine had also noticed that students who participated in multiple specialized instruction sessions began displaying physical symptoms. Beyond mere fatigue, they would sit quietly during meals, picking at their food with little appetite, and many complained of persistent headaches and nausea. Some developed a slight tremor in their hands, remarkably similar to Cordelia Ashworth's own nervous condition. When questioned about these symptoms, Dr. Marcus Ashworth would diagnose them as manifestations of spiritual sensitivity, evidence that the girls' souls were becoming more receptive to divine influence as their earthly attachments were gradually purged away. The Institute's routine during this period was rigidly structured, designed to eliminate any opportunity for students to communicate freely among themselves or develop relationships that might encourage independent thinking. The day began at 4:30 with chapel service, followed by a meager breakfast of weak coffee and hard bread. Classes ran from 6 in the morning until 7 in the evening, with only a brief break for a midday meal of thin broth and more bread. Evenings were devoted to moral instruction, lengthy sessions during which Jeremiah Ashworth would read from specially selected religious texts while the students sat in absolute silence, forbidden from asking questions or making comments. The schedule left the girls exhausted and isolated, unable to form bonds of friendship that might have provided comfort or strength. In the face of their increasingly dire circumstances, those who attempted to communicate through whispered conversations or passed notes found themselves subjected to severe punishments that effectively discouraged further attempts at connection. Yet despite these precautions, information began to spread among the students through a network of subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and carefully coded conversations that took place during supervised activities. Catherine O'Brien emerged as an unofficial leader in this underground communication system, using her position as one of the Institute's longest surviving students to gather and disseminate information about the institution's true nature. Through these covert channels, Catherine learned that the specialized instruction sessions involved more than religious education. Girls who had undergone these experiences described being given bitter-tasting tea that made them feel dizzy and disoriented, followed by activities they found difficult to remember clearly afterward. Some recalled being dressed in unusual clothing, white robes that resembled funeral shrouds rather than normal garments. Others remembered being required to participate in ceremonies involving candles, incense, and recited prayers in languages they did not recognize. Most disturbing were the accounts of the gentlemen who attended these sessions. The girls described men of various ages, all well-dressed and clearly prosperous, who spoke with the accents of education and refinement, but whose eyes held a hunger that made the students instinctively afraid. These men would observe the ceremonies from chairs arranged around the perimeter of the fourth-floor chambers, sometimes participating in the prayers and rituals, but always maintaining an air of detached authority that suggested they were not merely observers, but active participants in whatever was taking place. As winter gave way to spring in 1812, Catherine began to understand that she and her fellow students were trapped in a situation far more dangerous than simple educational fraud or religious extremism. They were prisoners in an institution that presented itself as a sanctuary of learning and moral development, but functioned as something far more sinister, something that required the systematic destruction of young women's spirits and ultimately their lives. The realization filled her with a mixture of terror and determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had survived longer than Emma, Rebecca, and Anne-Marie, but she could see the same symptoms beginning to manifest in herself and others. The trembling hands, the persistent fatigue, the growing difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks, all suggested that whatever process had claimed her friends' lives was now claiming her as well. But Catherine O'Brien had not endured 2 years of poverty, abandonment, and suffering only to surrender without a fight. As the spring of 1812 progressed, she began formulating a desperate plan, a plan that would either secure her freedom or ensure that the truth about Whitmore Institute would not die with her. The Institute's carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to face its first serious challenge, though it would take years for the full extent of the Ashworth family's crimes to be revealed to the world. The opportunity Catherine O'Brien had been waiting for came in the form of Miss Helena Worthington, a young woman whose arrival at Whitmore Institute in September of 1812 would prove to be the catalyst for events that Rosalind Ashworth could never have anticipated. Miss Worthington was not a student, but a new instructor hired to teach literature and natural sciences to the Institute's more advanced pupils. Her presence represented a significant departure from the Ashworth family's previous practice of keeping all educational duties within their immediate circle. Helena Worthington was 26 years old, the daughter of a successful Hartford attorney who had provided her with an education that was remarkable for its depth and breadth. She had studied at Miss Porter's Female Academy in Connecticut, where she had been exposed to progressive ideas about women's education and intellectual capabilities. Unlike the subdued, carefully controlled atmosphere that characterized Whitmore Institute, Miss Porter's institution had encouraged critical thinking, independent research, and open discussion of complex ideas. Miss Worthington had accepted the position at Whitmore for reasons both practical and idealistic. The salary offered by Rosalind Ashworth was substantial, more than she could earn at any other educational institution in New England, and the opportunity to work with disadvantaged girls appealed to her strong sense of social responsibility. Her father had initially objected to her decision to work at all, believing that a woman of her social standing should focus on finding a suitable husband rather than pursuing a career. But Helena had inherited her father's stubborn determination, along with his keen intellect, and she had convinced him that teaching would provide valuable experience in managing people and resources that would serve her well regardless of what path her life ultimately took. From her first day at the Institute, Helena noticed inconsistencies that troubled her analytical mind. The students she had been assigned to teach were clearly intelligent, but they displayed a curious passivity that seemed at odds with their obvious capabilities. When she asked questions designed to stimulate discussion and critical thinking, she was met with blank stares and mechanical recitations of facts that suggested rote memorization rather than genuine understanding. More puzzling still was the students' apparent fear of expressing opinions or asking questions of their own. In her previous teaching experience, Helena had found that young women, when given permission to think freely, were naturally curious and eager to explore new ideas. But the girls at Whitmore Institute seemed to have had all intellectual curiosity systematically suppressed, as if independent thought itself had been identified as a dangerous tendency that needed to be eliminated. During her first weeks at the Institute, Helena attributed these observations to the rigorous religious discipline that clearly dominated the institution's culture. She had been raised in a devoutly Episcopal household and understood the value of moral instruction and spiritual development, but as the autumn progressed, she began to suspect that something beyond ordinary religious education was responsible for the students' unusual behavior. The first concrete evidence of this came during a literature lesson in October, when she noticed that one of her brightest students, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Fletcher, was having difficulty concentrating on relatively simple reading comprehension exercises. Mary's hands trembled as she worked, and she frequently lost track of her thoughts midway through answering questions. When Helena gently inquired about her difficulties, Mary's response was both revealing and disturbing. "I'm sorry, Miss Worthington," Mary whispered, glancing nervously toward the classroom door as if afraid of being overheard. "Sometimes my mind feels cloudy, like there's a mist inside my head that makes it hard to think clearly. Dr. Ashworth says it's because my spirit is being purified, but I remember being able to think more clearly before I came here." This conversation planted the first seeds of serious concern in Helena's mind. She began paying closer attention to the physical condition of her students, and what she observed alarmed her. Many displayed symptoms that reminded her of patients she had seen during a typhoid outbreak in Hartford the previous year. Not the specific symptoms of that disease, but the same general appearance of systemic poisoning. They were pale, listless, and frequently complained of headaches and stomach ailments. Several had developed the same tremor that affected Cordelia Ashworth, and most showed signs of significant weight loss despite the Institute's claims that they were receiving adequate nutrition. Helena's growing suspicions were confirmed when she discovered that her access to certain areas of the Institute was strictly limited. She had been assigned quarters on the 3rd floor, but the 4th floor was declared off-limits to all faculty except members of the Ashworth family. When she innocently inquired about using one of the 4th-floor rooms for private tutoring sessions, Rosalind Ashworth's reaction was swift and decisive. "Miss Worthington," Rosalind said, her piercing blue eyes fixing Helena with an intensity that was both compelling and unsettling. "I'm sure you understand that an institution like ours must maintain certain boundaries and protocols. The 4th floor contains contemplation chambers, reserved for students undergoing advanced spiritual instruction. The atmosphere there is consecrated, you might say, and we cannot risk contaminating it with secular activities, no matter how well-intentioned." The firmness of this prohibition, combined with Rosalind's obvious discomfort at having the subject raised, convinced Helena that the 4th floor held secrets the Ashworth family was determined to protect. She began observing the Institute's nighttime routines more carefully, noting the patterns of activity that Mrs. Pemberton had witnessed from her cottage, but which were invisible to most residents of the Institute itself. It was during one of these covert observations that Helena first encountered Catherine O'Brien in circumstances that would forge an alliance between them. On a November evening, when sleet pelted the Institute's windows and wind howled around its corners, Helena was returning from the library when she noticed a figure moving stealthily through the corridor that led to the rear entrance. The figure was clearly one of the students, but she was not dressed in the standard brown wool dress that served as the Institute's uniform. Instead, she wore a white robe that seemed to glow in the dim light of the corridor's oil lamps. Helena followed at a distance, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet covering the hallway floors. She watched as the figure, whom she now recognized as Catherine O'Brien, approached the rear entrance and pressed her ear against the door. Catherine remained in this position for several minutes, clearly listening to something happening on the other side, before turning and retracing her steps. When Catherine spotted Helena in the shadows, both young women froze, uncertain how to proceed. The moment stretched between them, fraught with mutual recognition that they had both been engaged in activities that would be severely punished if discovered. Finally, Catherine stepped forward, her hazel eyes meeting Helena's with an intensity that conveyed both desperation and determination. "Miss Worthington," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of sleet against the windows, "I need to speak with you, but not here and not now. Tomorrow during your literature class, ask me to remain after to discuss my work. I have things to tell you that you need to know." The following day's literature lesson passed with agonizing slowness, but finally the other students were dismissed, and Catherine remained behind as arranged. What she told Helena during the next hour would shatter the young teacher's assumptions about Whitmore Institute and launch both women on a desperate quest for evidence that could expose the truth about the Ashworth family's crimes. Catherine's account was both detailed and horrifying. She described the specialized instruction sessions in clinical terms that suggested she had been observing and analyzing the Institute's operations with the systematic approach of a trained investigator. She explained the pattern of student deaths, the mysterious nighttime visitors, and the growing evidence that the girls were being systematically poisoned with substances that clouded their minds and weakened their bodies. Most shocking of all was Catherine's theory about the true purpose of the Institute. Based on overheard conversations, observed behaviors, and the accounts of students who had undergone specialized instruction, she believed that Whitmore Institute was not an educational institution at all, but rather an elaborate procurement operation designed to provide young women for the entertainment of wealthy and powerful men. The education and religious instruction were merely facades, designed to maintain the Institute's reputation, while the real business was conducted in the fourth-floor chambers under cover of darkness. "They're not just killing us, Miss Worthington," Catherine concluded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "They're destroying us first, our minds, our will, our ability to resist or escape. And then when we're too weak to fight anymore, they use us until we die. Emma, Rebecca, and Marie, they didn't die of fever or brain sickness. They were murdered as surely as if someone had put a blade through their hearts." Helena listened to this account with growing horror and a sick certainty that Catherine's analysis was correct. Too many pieces of the puzzle fit together to perfectly for this to be the product of an overwrought imagination. The trembling hands, the clouded minds, the mysterious visitors, the rigid control over information and movement, all of it pointed to a conspiracy of almost unimaginable evil. But even as she accepted the truth of Catherine's revelations, Helena understood the enormity of the challenge they faced. The Ashworth family was respected throughout Concord and beyond. Rosalind was considered a pillar of Christian virtue. Cordelia was beloved for her artistic talents and gentle demeanor, and Jeremiah's reputation as a powerful preacher had earned him admirers throughout New England. Accusations against such people, made by a working-class dressmaker and a charity student, would be dismissed as slander born of jealousy or mental instability. They would need evidence, concrete, undeniable proof of the crimes being committed at Whitmore Institute, and they would need to obtain this evidence without alerting the Ashworth family to their suspicions, because both women understood that discovery would mean certain death. The Institute had already demonstrated its ability to eliminate inconvenient witnesses while maintaining its facade of respectability. As winter settled over Concord in 1812, two women began a dangerous game of cat and mouse with their captors, seeking the proof that could save the surviving students and expose one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. But they were not the hunters in this game, they were the prey, and their quarry possessed resources, connections, and ruthlessness that neither of them fully comprehended. The winter of 1812 to 1813 transformed Whitmore Institute into a battleground, where the desperate women fought for evidence while their enemies closed in around them. With increasing suspicion and hostility, Helena Worthington and Catherine O'Brien had formed an unlikely alliance, an educated young woman from Hartford's professional class and an Irish orphan who had learned survival through suffering. But their different backgrounds proved to be an advantage as they developed a sophisticated intelligence operation within the Institute's walls. Their first breakthrough came through Helena's legitimate access to the Institute's administrative areas. As an instructor, she was permitted to use Rosalind Ashworth's office during certain hours to prepare lesson plans and grade assignments. During these sessions, she began systematically examining the files and documents that Rosalind kept in her locked desk, a task made possible by Catherine's childhood skills at picking locks, learned during her desperate months on Concord's streets before entering the Institute. What they discovered exceeded their worst fears. Hidden beneath conventional academic records and correspondence were detailed ledgers that recorded financial transactions, unlike anything a legitimate educational institution would maintain. The entries were written in a coded system, but the pattern became clear once they understood the underlying structure. Each student was assigned a number, and their progress was tracked through a series of evaluations that had nothing to do with academic achievement. Catherine's blood ran cold when she found her own entry. Subject 17, CO, Auburn, Hazel, 14 years. Conditioning progressing slowly, resistance above average, recommend increased dosage, and extended isolation periods, client interest moderate, but consistent, estimated transition to final phase 2 to 3 months. The clinical detachment of these notes was perhaps more horrifying than outright cruelty would have been. The girls were not seen as human beings, but as inventory, tracked and managed with the same dispassionate efficiency that a merchant might use to catalog bolts of fabric or barrels of grain. Worse still, the ledgers contained client preferences that read like a catalog of human depravity. Certain men preferred younger girls, others specified physical characteristics, and some had requested particular temperaments, shy, defiant, or what was euphemistically described as broken. But the most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence between Rosalind Ashworth and her clients. These letters, written in Rosalind's elegant handwriting, discussed arrangements with a frankness that left no doubt about the Institute's true purpose. One letter, dated December 3, 1812, addressed to someone identified only as the Honorable W.B., contained details that made both women feel physically ill. My dear friend, I am pleased to inform you that the young lady you inquired about has made significant progress in her preparation. The temperament issues you mentioned have been largely resolved through our specialized instruction methods, and I believe she will meet your exacting standards within the month. As always, our mutual discretion ensures that your association with our institution remains entirely confidential. Your usual contribution of $300 will be most gratefully received. The systematic nature of the operation became clear as they uncovered more documents. The Institute served as a procurement and conditioning center for a network of wealthy clients throughout New England and beyond. The girls were not simply exploited, they were systematically broken down through a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and physical abuse until they became compliant victims who could be rented to clients or sold outright to those willing to pay premium prices. The death of students like Emma, Rebecca, and Anne-Marie was not accidental but part of the business model. Girls who proved too resistant to conditioning, who became too ill to be profitable, or who posed security risks were eliminated with carefully administered overdoses of laudanum and other substances. Their deaths were then attributed to natural causes, with Dr. Marcus Ashworth providing the necessary medical certifications to avoid official investigation. As Helena and Catherine gathered this evidence, they became increasingly aware that their own activities were being monitored. Rosalind Ashworth had always been observant, but her scrutiny of Helena's behavior became more intense and pointed. During faculty meetings, Rosalind would ask seemingly innocent questions about Helena's lesson plans, her interactions with students, and her impressions of the Institute's educational methods. But beneath the polite inquiry, Helena could sense a predatory intelligence evaluating her responses for signs of suspicion or disloyalty. The pressure increased dramatically in February of 1813 when another student died under circumstances that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. Sarah Whitman, a 13-year-old from a poor farming family, had been at the Institute for only 6 months when she was found dead in her bed. On a Wednesday morning, unlike the previous deaths, which had been attributed to fever or brain sickness. Sarah showed no signs of illness before her death. She had simply failed to wake up, as if her life had been quietly extinguished during the night. Dr. Marcus Ashworth's examination of the body was perfunctory, lasting less than 15 minutes, before he declared the cause of death to be heart failure brought on by spiritual excitement. But Helena, who had observed Sarah closely during her literature classes, knew that the girl had shown no signs of heart problems. She had been pale and listless like the others, but she had also been one of the more alert students, still capable of asking intelligent questions and demonstrating genuine interest in her studies. More troubling still was the timing of Sarah's death. Catherine had confided to Helena that Sarah had been selected for specialized instruction on 4 consecutive evenings before her death, and that she had seemed particularly distressed after these sessions. According to other students, Sarah had been heard weeping in her sleep and had spoken of wanting to write a letter to her parents, a request that had been firmly denied by Cordelia Ashworth on the grounds that contact with family members would interfere with the spiritual development process. The night after Sarah's funeral, Helena made a decision that would either provide them with the evidence they needed or result in their own deaths. She resolved to infiltrate one of the specialized instruction sessions and witness firsthand what was happening in the 4th floor chambers. It was an enormous risk, but she had concluded that they would never gather sufficient evidence. Through document analysis alone, they needed to see the crimes being committed with their own eyes. Catherine initially opposed this plan, arguing that the risk was too great and that Helena's discovery would doom them both. But Helena had inherited her father's determination along with his legal acumen, and she had become convinced that half measures would not suffice. If they were going to expose the Ashworth family's crimes, they needed evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away by clever lawyers and corrupt officials. The opportunity came on March 15, 1813, a night when the 4th floor chambers were scheduled to host what the coded ledgers described as a grand assembly with multiple clients. Catherine had learned through her network of student informants that 8 girls had been selected for the session, including herself and 3 other long-term residents of the Institute. The session was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock in the evening, after the regular students had been secured in the dormitory and the Institute had settled into its nightly routine. Helena's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would conceal herself in one of the storage closets on the 4th floor before the evening session began, then observe the proceedings through a small ventilation grate that provided a clear view of the main chamber. Catherine would participate in the session as required, but she would attempt to remain as alert as possible despite whatever drug she was given, so that she could provide detailed testimony about anything Helena might not be able to see clearly. The plan required precise timing and considerable luck. Helena needed to reach the 4th floor and conceal herself before the Ashworth family began their preparations, but she also needed to ensure that her absence from her regular evening routine would not be noticed. She solved this problem by claiming to be suffering from a severe migraine that required her to retire early to her chamber, where she planned to spend the evening reading and preparing lessons for the following day. At 9:30, while the Institute settled into its evening quiet, Helena slipped out of her room and made her way to the servants' staircase that provided access to the 4th floor. The stairs creaked ominously under her weight, each sound seeming to echo through the building like a gunshot. She paused at every step, listening for signs that she had been detected before continuing her careful ascent. The 4th floor was dimly lit by oil lamps placed at intervals along the corridor. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of incense and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded Helena of the ether she had once been given during a dental procedure. The walls were lined with religious paintings depicting scenes of martyrdom and suffering, their dark colors and graphic imagery creating an atmosphere of oppression and doom. Helena located the storage closet she had identified during her reconnaissance and carefully opened its door. Inside she found cleaning supplies, extra linens, and most importantly, a wooden crate that she could use as a platform to reach the ventilation grate near the ceiling. She positioned herself carefully, ensuring that she could see into the main chamber while remaining hidden in the shadows. At exactly 10 o'clock, she heard footsteps in the corridor and the sound of multiple voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Through the grate, she watched as Cordelia Ashworth entered the chamber carrying a silver tray laden with delicate porcelain cups. Behind her came Jeremiah Ashworth, dressed in ceremonial robes that transformed his already imposing figure into something that seemed to have stepped out of a medieval nightmare. But it was Rosalind Ashworth who commanded the room when she entered, her presence filling the space with an authority that was both magnetic and terrifying. She had exchanged her usual black dress for an elaborate gown of deep crimson silk, adorned with symbols that Helena did not recognize, but which seemed to pulse with malevolent significance in the flickering lamplight. The chamber itself had been transformed from whatever purpose it normally served into something that resembled a twisted parody of a church sanctuary. Candles burned in elaborate candelabras placed around the perimeter of the room, their flames casting dancing shadows on walls hung with tapestries depicting scenes that made Helena's stomach churn. At the center of the room was a raised platform covered with white silk, surrounded by chairs arranged in a precise circle. As Helena watched in growing horror, the 8 selected students were led into the chamber. Catherine was among them, along with Mary Fletcher and 6 other girls whose names Helena knew from her classroom rosters. All were dressed in the same white robes that Catherine had worn during her earlier reconnaissance, and all moved with the dreamlike quality that suggested they had already been drugged. But the true horror began when the clients arrived. Through the rear entrance came 8 men, all well-dressed and clearly prosperous, their faces bearing the confident expressions of individuals accustomed to having their desires satisfied regardless of the cost to others. Helena recognized at least 4 of them: a prominent Concord banker, a federal judge from Boston, a state senator whose speeches on moral reform had made him famous throughout New England, and a wealthy merchant whose donations to various churches had earned him a reputation for Christian charity. What she witnessed during the next 3 hours would haunt her for the rest of her life. The specialized instruction was revealed to be an elaborate ritual of exploitation and abuse, conducted with ceremonial precision that somehow made it even more horrifying than random violence would have been. The drugged students were manipulated and violated while the clients observed and participated, their actions guided by Jeremiah Ashworth's liturgical directions and accompanied by Cordelia's haunting musical performances. Rosalind Ashworth orchestrated the entire proceeding with the efficiency of a theatrical director, ensuring that each client's preferences were satisfied while maintaining the religious facade that seemed to provide psychological cover for the participants. The girls were treated not as human beings, but as sacred objects in a blasphemous ceremony, their suffering transformed into something that the participants could interpret as spiritual rather than criminal. When the session finally ended and the clients departed through the rear entrance, Helena remained hidden in her closet for another hour, too shaken to move and afraid that any sound might betray her presence. She had obtained the evidence she needed, but she had also learned something that filled her with despair. The scope and sophistication of the Ashworth operation made it clear that challenging them would require resources and connections that she and Catherine simply did not possess. The network of powerful men who patronized Whitmore Institute included judges, legislators, bankers, and clergy, individuals with the authority to suppress investigations, discredit witnesses, and ensure that any accusations against the Ashworth family would be dismissed as the fantasies of unstable women. Even if Helena and Catherine managed to escape the Institute and reach the authorities, they would be pitting their word against some of the most respected men in New England. As she finally crept back to her chamber in the early morning hours, Helena understood that they faced a choice between certain death if they remained silent and probable death if they attempted to expose the truth. But they also carried with them the knowledge that dozens of other girls would suffer and die if the Institute continued its operations unchallenged. The game of cat and mouse had entered its final phase, and the stakes could not be higher. In the days that followed, both women would need to summon reserves of courage and cunning they did not know they possessed, because their enemies had begun to suspect that their secrets were no longer safe. The end began on March 22, 1813, a date that would forever be seared into Helena Worthington's memory not as the first day of spring, but as the morning when Rosalind Ashworth's mask finally slipped completely away. Helena awoke to find a note slipped under her door, written in Rosalind's elegant script. "Miss Worthington, please join me in my office immediately after morning chapel. We have urgent matters to discuss regarding your future at this institution." The tone was superficially polite, but Helena recognized the underlying threat. Something had alerted Rosalind to her nocturnal activities, and this meeting would likely determine whether she lived to see another sunset. As she dressed with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm, Helena wondered if Catherine had also received a similar summons, or if her young accomplice had already been silenced. During the night, chapel service that morning was a study in barely controlled tension. Rosalind conducted the proceedings with her usual commanding presence, but Helena noticed subtle signs of agitation, a slight tremor in her voice when she read from scripture, a tendency to grip the pulpit with unusual force, and most tellingly, the way her piercing blue eyes kept returning to scan the assembled students, as if conducting an inventory. Catherine was present among the other girls, but she appeared more heavily drugged than usual. Her hazel eyes, normally sharp with intelligence, even when clouded by laudanum, seemed almost vacant, and she swayed slightly as she stood during the hymns. When their gazes met briefly across the chapel, Catherine's expression conveyed a message that chilled Helena to the bone. She knew they had been discovered, and she was resigned to whatever fate awaited them. After chapel, Helena made her way to Rosalind's office with steps that felt like a condemned prisoner's walk to the gallows. She found Rosalind seated behind her mahogany desk, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of benevolent educator. The woman who looked up at Helena's entrance was a predator who had finally cornered her prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. "Please sit down, Miss Worthington," Rosalind said, her voice carrying the silky menace of a blade wrapped in velvet. "We have a great deal to discuss." Helena took the indicated chair, fighting to keep her expression neutral despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing explanations and denials. But faced with Rosalind's knowing gaze, she understood that deception was futile. "I trust you found your recent evening explorations educational," Rosalind continued, opening a leather-bound folder that Helena recognized with a sinking heart. It contained detailed sketches of the fourth-floor layout, copies of coded ledger entries, and most damning of all, several pages covered with Helena's own handwriting, notes she had made while analyzing the evidence she and Catherine had gathered. The folder represented weeks of careful investigation, but it also represented a catastrophic security breach that Rosalind could not have discovered. Through ordinary surveillance, someone had betrayed them, someone who had access to Helena's private papers and knowledge of their activities. "You seem surprised," Rosalind observed, noting Helena's shock. "Did you really believe that your amateur espionage could escape notice in an institution where information is our most valuable commodity, my dear Miss Worthington? We have been monitoring your activities since your 4th week here. Every document you examined, every conversation you held with students, every midnight excursion, all of it has been carefully observed and recorded." The revelation hit Helena like a physical blow. If Rosalind had known about their investigation from the beginning, then everything they had discovered had been permitted, even orchestrated. The evidence they thought they had stolen had been deliberately left for them to find. The question was why. Rosalind seemed to read her thoughts. "You're wondering why we allowed you to continue your little investigation when we could have eliminated you at any time. The answer is quite simple. You were useful to us. Your presence provided an excellent test of our security procedures and helped us identify weaknesses in our operational protocols. More importantly, your activities helped us locate a potential problem that had been developing among certain students." As if summoned by these words, Jeremiah Ashworth entered the office, his gaunt frame blocking the doorway like a specter of death. Behind him came two men Helena had never seen before, large, roughly dressed individuals whose presence suggested that the Institute employed resources beyond the Ashworth family members. Miss O'Brien has been most cooperative in explaining the extent of your conspiracy," Jeremiah announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully run his quarry to ground. "She provided us with detailed information about your methods, your discoveries, and most importantly, your plans for exposing our operations to the authorities." The betrayal cut deeper than Helena had thought possible. Catherine, the brave girl who had risked everything to gather evidence against their captors, had apparently broken under pressure and revealed their secrets. But even as this realization threatened to crush her spirit, Helena noticed something in Jeremiah's eyes that suggested the situation might be more complex. Then it appeared. Rosalind rose from her desk and moved to stand directly in front of Helena, her imposing presence filling the young woman's field of vision. "The question now, Miss Worthington, is what to do with you. Your father is a prominent attorney with connections throughout Hartford's legal community. Your disappearance would be noticed and investigated in ways that would be inconvenient for our operations. However, your continued existence poses risks that we cannot tolerate. There is, however, a third option," Rosalind continued, her voice taking on a seductive quality that was somehow more terrifying than outright threats. "You could join us willingly. Your education and social connections would make you a valuable addition to our organization. We have operations in other cities that require sophisticated management, and your talents would be well compensated in positions of real authority." The offer was presented as a genuine choice, but Helena understood the underlying reality. Acceptance would mean becoming complicit in the systematic destruction of young lives. Refusal would mean death, probably disguised as an accident or sudden illness that would generate sympathy. Rather than suspicion, there was no third alternative, at least none that Rosalind was willing to acknowledge, as Helena struggled to formulate a response that might buy her more time. Commotion erupted in the corridor outside Rosalind's office. Shouts echoed through the building, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps and doors being thrown open. Rosalind's expression shifted from predatory satisfaction to confusion and then to something approaching fear. The office door burst open to admit a group of men wearing the blue uniforms of the Massachusetts State Constabulary, led by a tall, stern-faced officer whose presence immediately transformed the dynamics in the room. Behind the constables came a figure that made Helena's heart leap with impossible hope: Catherine O'Brien, her hazel eyes blazing with fierce determination and very much alive. "Rosalind Ashworth," the lead constable announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. Jeremiah Ashworth and Cordelia Ashworth, you are also under arrest on the same charges. Gentlemen," he addressed the two rough men, "you will remain here for questioning." Rosalind's composure cracked completely for the first time since Helena had known her. "This is preposterous," she declared, her voice rising to a near shriek. "These officers have no authority here. This is a private educational institution operating under proper charter from the Commonwealth." But the constable was unmoved by her protests. "Ma'am, we have sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, documentary evidence of criminal conspiracy, and eyewitness accounts of crimes committed on these premises. You will come with us now, peacefully, or we will use whatever force is necessary to compel your compliance." As the constables moved to place the Ashworth family members in custody, Catherine approached Helena with an expression that mixed triumph with exhaustion. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," she whispered urgently. "When they confronted me 3 days ago, I realized it was our only chance. They thought I was broken, that I would betray everything to save myself. Instead, I told them exactly what they wanted to hear while I found a way to get word to the authorities." The plan that Catherine had executed was breathtaking in its audacity and desperation. When confronted by Jeremiah about her activities, she had indeed confessed everything, but she had also convinced him that her cooperation was motivated by fear and that she would do anything to avoid punishment. Using this facade of compliance, she had gained access to parts of the institute normally forbidden to students, including the rear entrance that connected to the outside world. During the early morning hours, while her captors believed her to be securely drugged and confined, Catherine had slipped out of the institute and made her way to the Concord Constabulary Station. Her account of the crimes being committed at Whitmore Institute had initially been met with skepticism, but her detailed knowledge of names, dates, and financial transactions had convinced the authorities to launch an immediate investigation. More importantly, Catherine had been able to provide the constables with a list of prominent clients who were scheduled to visit the institute that very evening, a list that included several judges and legislators whose corruption could not be hidden if they were arrested in the act of exploiting drugged children. The prospect of exposing such a scandal had galvanized the authorities into action, overcoming their usual reluctance to challenge respected institutions and prominent citizens. As the Ashworth family was led away in chains, their carefully constructed empire of exploitation began to crumble with shocking rapidity. Within hours, constables had arrested Dr. Marcus Ashworth at his private practice, while other officers moved to secure the institute's records and interview the surviving students. The network of powerful men who had patronized the institute found themselves facing exposure and disgrace as their names appeared in the seized documents and testimony from witnesses who could no longer be silenced. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the dressmaker whose early suspicions had been dismissed as the fantasies of a working-class woman with no understanding of how respectable institutions operated. When investigators interviewed her, they discovered that she had been keeping detailed records of her observations for more than 2 years, documenting the mysterious nighttime visitors, the strange lights in the sanctuary windows, and the gradual deterioration of the students she had observed during her deliveries. Her testimony provided crucial corroboration for the accounts given by Catherine and Helena, transforming their accusations from the word of biased witnesses to part of a comprehensive pattern of evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The woman who had been ignored because of her social status became the key witness, whose observations anchored the prosecution's case. The trial of the Ashworth family would become one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Massachusetts history, exposing corruption that reached to the highest levels of New England society and revealing the vulnerability of the poor and powerless to exploitation by those who presented themselves as pillars of moral virtue. But the full scope of their crimes would not be understood until investigators had time to analyze the complete documentary record and interview all of the survivors who were willing to speak. The complete investigation of Whitmore Institute took nearly 8 months and revealed an operation of staggering scope and sophistication that had operated virtually undetected for almost 3 years. When the final accounting was completed, investigators determined that 49 young women had died at the institute, not from natural causes as their death certificates claimed, but from systematic poisoning designed to eliminate witnesses and dispose of victims who had become too damaged to be profitable. The trial began in November of 1813 and lasted for 9 weeks, generating newspaper coverage throughout the United States and even in European publications that characterized it as evidence of the moral corruption that inevitably rose in democratic societies. Rosalind Ashworth, maintaining her composure even in the face of overwhelming evidence, attempted to portray herself as a victim of circumstances who had been manipulated by male relatives and clients. But the testimony of survivors, combined with her own meticulously kept records, painted a picture of a woman who had conceived and orchestrated every aspect of the Institute's criminal operations. Jeremiah Ashworth adopted a different strategy, claiming that he had been conducting legitimate religious ceremonies that had been misinterpreted by witnesses who lacked proper theological education. His defense collapsed when investigators discovered that the religious rituals he described matched no known Christian doctrine and appeared to have been invented specifically to provide psychological cover for systematic sexual exploitation. Cordelia Ashworth proved to be the most tragic figure in the conspiracy. Medical examination revealed that she had been drugged consistently for more than a decade, rendering her mentally incompetent and transforming her into an unwitting accomplice in her family's crimes. Her musical performances during the exploitation sessions had been the product of careful conditioning rather than willing participation, and she retained almost no memory of the events she had helped facilitate. The network of prominent clients who had patronized the Institute face varying fates, depending on their social connections and political influence. Several judges and legislators were quietly forced to resign their positions and leave Massachusetts, while others managed to avoid prosecution through strategic bribes and destroyed evidence. But the scandal destroyed the careers of at least 15 men who had believed their wealth and status would protect them from consequences. Dr. Marcus Ashworth received a sentence of 25 years in prison for his role in falsifying death certificates and providing medical support for the family's operations. His conviction effectively ended the medical careers of several other physicians who had been involved in similar schemes throughout New England, sending a clear message that professional credentials would not shield criminals from prosecution. Rosalind and Jeremiah Ashworth were sentenced to death by hanging, making Rosalind the first woman executed in Massachusetts for crimes other than witchcraft. The sentences were carried out on January 12, 1814, before a crowd of more than 3,000 spectators who had traveled from throughout New England to witness the end of what newspapers had dubbed the most depraved criminal conspiracy in American history. Catherine O'Brien's courage in exposing the Institute's crimes made her a celebrity throughout the United States, with newspapers portraying her as a symbol of virtue triumphing over corruption. She used her newfound fame to advocate for improved protection of orphaned and impoverished children, eventually establishing her own legitimate educational institution in Boston that provided free schooling for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. Her academy operated successfully for more than 40 years and educated hundreds of young women who went on to become teachers, nurses, and activists in their own right. Helena Worthington returned to Hartford after the trial and married a fellow educator who shared her commitment to educational reform. Together they founded a progressive school that emphasized critical thinking and independent inquiry rather than rote memorization and blind obedience to authority. Helena spent the rest of her life working to ensure that educational institutions would be subject to regular oversight and inspection, preventing the kind of isolated abuse that had flourished at Whitmore Institute. The Institute building itself was demolished in 1814, with the materials sold to help compensate the families of victims. The site remained vacant for more than 30 years before being developed into a public park, dedicated to the memory of the girls who had died there. A simple monument erected through donations from throughout New England bears the names of all 49 victims along with an inscription that reads, "They were forgotten by the world, but not by history." The most lasting impact of the Whitmore Institute scandal was the changes it prompted in how educational institutions were regulated and monitored. Massachusetts became the first state to require regular inspections of all schools, particularly those serving vulnerable populations, and to mandate that educational institutions maintain detailed records that were subject to official review. These reforms were gradually adopted by other states and became the foundation for modern educational oversight systems. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the precedent. It established that wealth, social position, and religious authority could not shield criminals from prosecution when sufficient evidence was presented by credible witnesses. The conviction of the Ashworth family and their prominent clients demonstrated that American justice, when properly functioning, could hold even the most powerful members of society accountable for their crimes. The story of Whitmore Institute serves as a reminder of how easily institutions designed to protect the vulnerable can be corrupted by those who see weakness as an opportunity for exploitation. It shows us that evil often wears the mask of virtue, that respectability can be a cover for unspeakable crimes, and that the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for truth can ultimately triumph over systematic corruption. In the immortal words of Catherine O'Brien, spoken during her testimony at the trial, "They thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They thought they could use us and discard us without consequence, because no one would believe our word against theirs. But they forgot that even the powerless can find power when they stand together for truth." Today, more than 2 centuries after these events, we still struggle with the same fundamental challenges, protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them ensuring that institutions serve their stated purposes rather than hidden agendas, and maintaining the courage to speak truth to power even when doing so requires enormous personal sacrifice. The girls who died at Whitmore Institute were not forgotten by history, and their story continues to remind us that the price of allowing evil to flourish is always higher than the cost of confronting it. Their voices, silenced by their tormentors, but preserved in the testimony of survivors and the records of their suffering, still echo across the centuries with a simple but powerful message: remember us, learn from our sacrifice, and never again allow such horrors to be committed in the name of virtue, education, or faith. In remembering them, we honor not only their memory, but also our obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe that such systematic exploitation could happen today under the cover of respectability and religious authority? Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that go beyond the surface to explore the deeper questions about power, corruption, and justice. Hit that like button if this investigation into America's hidden past resonated with you, and subscribe to the Holloway Archives to never miss stories that reveal the secrets others would prefer to keep buried. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our community of truth seekers values every perspective on these complex historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the past has lessons for those brave enough to listen.